She screamed as the door slammed behind her, and every shadow in the room seemed to lean closer. Someone was watching, and escape wasn't an option. Jasmine's chest heaved, fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if it could steady her trembling body. The diner, usually a place of routine and small comforts, felt suddenly alien, every corner sharp and accusing. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, casting a pallid glow across the linoleum floor, illuminating her fear like a spotlight. The new manager stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, clipboard clutched like a weapon. His smirk never reached his eyes, and every move he made carried the quiet weight of authority, tainted with something colder, sharper. Jasmine felt the familiar, heavy sting of being watched, judged not for her work, but for the color of her skin. A subtle, constant pressure that she had learned to carry silently for years now pressed down on her chest, making each breath shallow and deliberate. "Tray over there," he said, pointing toward a cart stacked with dirty plates. "And make sure you don't mix them up this time." Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had been doing this job for 3 years, every plate, every tray, every order memorized like second nature. Yet, in his eyes, she was suddenly inexperienced, incompetent, expendable. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even, steady, hiding the tremor of indignation that rose in her chest. She moved deliberately, each step calculated, refusing to let her anger or fear show. A regular at the counter, a man with a baseball cap pulled low, chuckled softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "But she can't even carry it without dropping something," he muttered. Jasmine's fingers tightened around the tray, the porcelain pressing cold and unforgiving into her palms. She forced a smile toward the woman seated at the corner table, the one with the 2 restless children, who looked up at her with quiet curiosity, oblivious to the tension in the air. The manager followed, close enough that his shadow fell across her path, a silent reminder that he was in control. "Careful," he said, a faint sneer hidden behind his words. "Don't want to make a mess." She clenched her jaw and kept moving, careful not to meet his gaze, careful to ignore the whispers from nearby tables. Every interaction was a minefield, each step an act of balancing between dignity and survival. Jasmine had learned to navigate these microaggressions before, but today they felt sharper, more deliberate, as if each word, each glance had been chosen to sting. At the next table, a cup of coffee trembled in her hand. She set it down with precise care, making sure it landed squarely on the coaster. The man sitting there raised an eyebrow, and she caught the faintest smirk playing on his lips. Jasmine forced herself to look away, her throat tight, as the manager's gaze bore into her from across the room. The morning wore on like this, each customer interaction an invisible test, each glance from the manager a subtle reminder of her place. He circled the room, clipboard in hand, jotting notes as if documenting her every move. Each small mistake, real or imagined, was magnified, thrown into the spotlight in a way that made her stomach churn with a mixture of frustration and dread. A co-worker, a young man named Tyler, peeked nervously from behind counter. His eyes flickered between Jasmine and the manager, worry etched across his face. She caught his gaze and gave him a slight nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was aware of the tension and would bear it without complaint, at least for now. Then came the overt laugh. The manager's voice rose just above the murmur of conversation as he addressed a nearby customer. "Watch her," he said. "It's fascinating how she handles herself." The words were masked as casual humor, but Jasmine felt the edge of contempt slice through her carefully maintained composure. Every head in the diner seemed to pivot, some sneering, some curious, some quietly judgmental. Her hands shook slightly as she refilled a pitcher of water. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, a pounding rhythm that echoed the shame and humiliation pressed into her by unseen eyes. Years of restraint, of silencing her instincts and emotions, felt suddenly brittle, like a thin glass threatening to shatter. "Are you done yet?" The manager barked from behind her, his tone clipped and impatient. Jasmine froze for a moment, aware of every person in the diner, noticing the rising tension. She forced herself to breathe slowly, measuredly, and finally straightened, setting the pitcher down with a faint clink. Her eyes met his for the briefest second, a spark of defiance flashing before she looked away. A few customers whispered among themselves, the murmur of voices blending with the low hum of conversation. Jasmine felt the prick of judgment in every word, every glance. The diner was no longer just a workplace. It was a stage for subtle cruelty, and she was the unwilling performer. She moved to clear a table near the window, her movements precise, deliberate. The manager trailed behind, his clipboard tapping lightly against his leg, a subtle percussion that echoed like a heartbeat in the tense room. Every step, every action felt monitored, evaluated, critiqued, not for her efficiency, but for her very identity, for the unspoken assumptions they all held about her. By mid-morning, Jasmine's muscles ached, her mind buzzed with tension. Every tray she carried, every order she placed, was a careful dance of survival, a constant negotiation with humiliation. She poured coffee for a regular, forcing her hands steady, hiding the tremor in her fingers, hiding the storm of emotion she felt behind the walls of professionalism. The manager's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just a facial expression, it was a claim of power, a silent assertion that she belonged exactly where he said she did. Jasmine clenched her fists under the counter, her teeth biting down on the edge of her lip to keep the words from spilling out, to keep her rage contained. And yet, despite the humiliation, despite the oppressive atmosphere, Jasmine refused to break. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and moved to the next table, each step deliberate, each breath measured. She would survive this morning. She would endure. But deep inside, a fire began to kindle, a quiet, burning promise that she would not be humiliated forever. The shadows of the diner stretched long as the morning light shifted, and Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. The subtle jabs, the whispers, the smirks, they were the first wave of a storm that threatened to consume her. But somewhere deep in her chest, behind the fear and humiliation, a seed of resistance took root, waiting for the moment to rise. By mid-morning, the diner had filled with the hum of casual chatter and clattering dishes. But for Jasmine, the noise felt distant, almost drowned out by the sharp, oppressive presence of the manager hovering nearby. His eyes never left her, following her movements like a hawk circling prey. Every small action she took, the way she wiped the table, poured coffee, or refilled a sugar jar, was scrutinized, criticized in silence, and weighed against some invisible standard she could never meet. "Are you seriously going to leave that tip tray like that?" he barked suddenly, his voice cutting through the din like glass. A nearby customer turned in surprise, their eyes flicking between Jasmine and the manager. Her hands froze on the tray, and a heat rose to her cheeks, sharp and burning. She bent slightly to correct it, keeping her voice low, professional, almost invisible. "Sorry, sir," she murmured. The manager smirked, a slow curl of satisfaction playing across his face. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, and addressed the nearest table of customers with mock cheerfulness. "Don't worry, folks, she's learning. She's trying." Jasmine felt a tremor run through her chest. The words were casual, almost playful, but they cut deeper than any direct insult. Every person in the diner had noticed. Some whispered, some laughed quietly, and a few stared openly, their gazes like tiny daggers. She moved to the next table, her hands shaking slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. A spilled cup of coffee on the edge of a tray sent a ripple of tension through her chest. She grabbed a napkin and cleaned it quickly, heart hammering, trying to make it look like nothing had happened. The manager's eyes followed every movement, and she could feel the silent judgment, the unspoken accusation. Clumsy, unworthy, out of place. One of the regulars, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, leaned forward and whispered to his companion, loud enough for Jasmine to catch, She looks nervous. Can't imagine why. A flicker of fury sparked in her chest, but she swallowed it, knowing any visible reaction would only give him more power. She straightened, shoulders rigid, and forced herself to keep moving, every motion precise, deliberate, controlled. Her coworker, Tyler, hovered nearby, fidgeting with a rag and offering nervous glances. Jasmine caught his eye briefly and gave him a subtle nod, a silent plea. Not now. She didn't need pity, and she didn't need distraction. She needed to survive the morning with what dignity she could salvage. But the humiliation pressed down on her relentlessly, a weight she could not shake. "Miss Jasmine," the manager called, snapping her attention back. "Check that table. They've been waiting for 5 minutes, and I don't want excuses." His voice carried across the diner, drawing attention like a spotlight. The customers looked on, some curious, some amused. Jasmine's stomach knotted as she rushed toward the table, heart pounding, aware that every eye was on her. She reached the table and offered the menu with a tight, polite smile. The customers glanced at her with mild curiosity, whispering softly among themselves. Every word she spoke, every movement she made, was now performed under the weight of scrutiny. She poured water into glasses, refilled napkins, all the while feeling the manager's eyes burning into her back. A young man at the counter snickered. "Man, she's shaking like a leaf," he whispered to his friend. Jasmine clenched her jaw, forcing herself to continue. The humiliation was thick, almost tangible, and yet she refused to let it break her outwardly. Inside, however, anger and hurt churned like a storm. Each insult, each whispered comment, each mocking glance feeding the fire. The manager approached, leaning over her shoulder as she wiped down a table. "Be careful," he said softly, almost conspiratorially, wouldn't want anything else to spill on the floor. The words were innocent in isolation, but layered over the constant scrutiny, the constant belittling, they became another nail in the coffin of her dignity. Jasmine forced her lips into a thin line, nodding without speaking, letting the silence serve as her shield. A few of the customers whispered more openly now, glancing between Jasmine and the manager. One woman raised an eyebrow, giving a small, disapproving shake of her head. Jasmine could feel the stares, the silent judgment, the cruel amusement in their eyes. She moved to another table, refilling coffee, carefully measuring each pour to appear flawless. Her hands were steady, but her chest ached with the weight of constant tension. "Really?" the manager muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jasmine to hear. "You call that service?" The words were slow, deliberate, a casual mockery meant to make her small, insignificant, exposed. She forced a smile, a thin mask of professionalism, and continued, knowing that any confrontation now would escalate matters in front of the customers. A young woman seated at a booth glanced at her, eyes wide with a mixture of pity and fascination. Jasmine caught the look and forced herself not to react. She had learned long ago that pity from strangers was worse than overt cruelty. It reminded her that she was being judged simply for existing in this space as a black woman. The manager's attention sharpened, like a predator honing in on prey. He stepped closer, leaning over the counter and speaking in a low tone just for her to hear. "Do you even know what you're doing? Or is this all just guesswork?" Jasmine swallowed hard, her throat tight. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to respond, to defend herself, but she kept silent. She had learned that words here, any words, would only be twisted into more ammunition against her. A regular at the end of the counter whispered to his friend, nodding toward her, "Poor girl, she doesn't stand a chance with him watching like that." Jasmine felt her stomach twist, not at the pity, but at the powerlessness in the room. The diner, once a place of work, of routine, of familiar faces, had become a cage. Each table, each tray, each glance was a barrier to her dignity, and she felt herself shrinking beneath it. Her hands shook slightly as she cleared a table near the window. A napkin slipped from her grip, fluttering to the floor. The manager's eyes locked on it immediately. "Seriously?" he asked, voice rising, drawing the attention of half the diner. "You can't even manage that." Whispers rippled through the customers. Some laughed softly. Others glanced away, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, humiliation burning like acid in her veins. She bent quickly, retrieved the napkin, and straightened, forcing her jaw tight and her expression neutral. Inside, anger swelled, shame burned, and yet, beneath it all, a quiet, resolute fire began to kindle. She would not break completely today. She would endure this, survive this, and find her moment to reclaim her dignity. But the manager's smirk, the whispers, the stares, they pressed down, suffocating, relentless, a storm building in the small space of the diner, a storm that promised a reckoning yet to come. By early afternoon, the diner had grown crowded. The low hum of chatter, the clatter of plates, and the occasional laughter of families should have been comforting. But for Jasmine, it felt like a trap tightening around her. Every step she took carried the weight of scrutiny. The manager's shadow stretched over her like a predator, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Come here," he said suddenly, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw every head in the room toward them. Jasmine froze, a tray trembling slightly in her hands. Patrons glanced up from their meals, curious and apprehensive, sensing the tension radiating from the exchange. She felt the heat rise to her face, not embarrassment at the mistake she hadn't made, but the shame imposed upon her by someone who thought his power was absolute. "Now," he repeated, sharper this time, stepping closer. Before she could respond, he gripped her arm with firm, unyielding pressure, tugging her toward the narrow corridor at the back of the diner. Her heart leapt violently, panic flaring. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with the weight of onlookers. Whispers traveled like wildfire. "Is he really dragging her? What did she do?" The murmurs buzzed around her, amplifying the humiliation. Jasmine's mind raced. She had prepared for verbal jabs, subtle microaggressions, even public embarrassment, but this was physical. Her stomach twisted with fear and anger. She twisted her body, trying to resist, but his grip was ironclad. Every step down the corridor felt heavy, as if the floor itself were conspiring against her, making each movement more difficult, more charged with dread. The customers at nearby tables leaned forward, some whispering to each other, some frozen in disbelief. A mother clutched her child, the little boy wide-eyed. No one moved to intervene. The diner had become a stage, and Jasmine the unwilling centerpiece of a spectacle she had never asked to be part of. "Stop it," she hissed under her breath, her voice trembling, but it was swallowed by the ambient noise. He didn't release her. The grip tightened, dragging her past the kitchen door, past the staff who exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to act or stay silent. Jasmine's breaths came fast, shallow, sharp as broken glass. She struggled, twisting, tugging at his arm, but he held firm. Her apron caught slightly on the edge of counter, and she felt the scratch of fabric against skin, the minor injury just another symbol of the aggression she faced. Her pride and her body felt under siege at the same time, her dignity eroding with each step. The corridor leading to the back bathroom was narrow, lined with boxes and cleaning supplies. The walls seemed to close in around her as the manager shoved her forward. Jasmine's mind raced with a mixture of fear and fury. Every instinct screamed to fight, to push back, to refuse, but reason held her in check. Resistance could escalate, could hurt her in ways the manager wanted, ways the public could see. A clatter echoed from the kitchen, startling her. A dropped pan, the clang reverberating off the walls. Her heart jumped, eyes darting toward the opening. A few coworkers peeked out, but none stepped forward. The weight of isolation pressed down on her as heavily as the manager's hand on her arm. Her mind flashed briefly to DARIUS, her husband, though she didn't dare speak his name. He was elsewhere, likely unaware, and the thought made her chest tighten even more. She had always believed she could handle anything at work, but today, the humiliation had escalated beyond words, beyond even controlled restraint. Not so fast, the manager said, yanking her roughly. Jasmine stumbled slightly, catching herself on the wall. Her face burned, a hot flush of shame and anger. She could feel eyes following her from the corridor entrance, some curious, some horrified, some silently entertained. The diner had become a theater, and every movement of hers was being dissected, judged, laughed at. Her voice rose despite herself. "Let go of me." The words were sharp, trembling with emotion. She twisted in his grip, and for a heartbeat, she thought she might break free. But the manager tightened his hold, pulling her closer toward the back bathroom, the space constricting, suffocating. The door loomed ahead, a simple wooden panel, but now it represented confinement, control, and potential danger. Jasmine's mind raced, calculating every possibility. Escape seemed impossible. Resistance seemed futile. Her fear coiled in her stomach like a living thing, demanding she act, while logic warned her to stay controlled. The manager finally shoved her into the small bathroom, the door clicking shut behind them. The confined space amplified the tension, the air thick with the smell of cleaning chemicals and something metallic, panic, adrenaline, humiliation. Jasmine pressed herself against the wall, trying to create distance, trying to catch her breath. "You think you could just serve coffee and talk back?" he hissed, advancing toward her. His shadow swallowed the cramped room, the flickering fluorescent light above making him look larger, more menacing. Jasmine's hands curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She refused to scream again, refusing to give him the satisfaction of fear fully visible. The sound of muffled voices drifted in from outside. Customers and coworkers whispered and murmured, unsure, unwilling to intervene directly. Jasmine's isolation deepened, but a spark of defiance ignited inside her. She would not be silenced, not entirely. The fire of dignity burned despite the fear, despite the humiliation, despite the undeniable imbalance of power. The manager sneered, sensing her internal struggle, enjoying the spectacle, relishing the imbalance. "You think anyone here will care about you?" he taunted. Jasmine's mind flashed, furious but controlled. She would survive. She had to survive. She would not let him make her invisible. Every second stretched, taut with suspense. Every breath she drew seemed magnified. The manager's presence was oppressive, suffocating, yet the room also held a tension of possibility, some force waiting beyond the door, some reckoning yet to arrive. Jasmine's body trembled, but her eyes burned with defiance, a promise unspoken. She would reclaim her dignity, even if she had to tear it back herself. The moments dragged, heavy with the electric weight of humiliation and fear. Jasmine's heart raced, and somewhere deep in the corridors of the diner, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The clatter of dishes from the main diner faded into the background as Jasmine pressed herself against the cold bathroom wall, heart hammering like a drum. Her breathing came in short, sharp bursts, and her eyes darted around the cramped room, measuring every inch of space. The manager loomed over her, a shadow of authority and cruelty, smirking with the smug satisfaction of someone who thought he had total control. Suddenly, the faint hum of the diner's front door swung into her awareness. A figure paused in the entryway, his presence calm but commanding, cutting through the tension like a knife. Jasmine's head jerked toward the sound, disbelief momentarily freezing her. Her husband, DARIUS, was there, calm, observant, unmoved by the whispers and murmurs of the other patrons. Darius's eyes scanned the diner before landing on the narrow corridor leading to the bathroom. The grip of fear that had paralyzed Jasmine loosened slightly as she met his gaze. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He simply assessed the scene, the corners of his mouth set in a thin line of resolve. Jasmine felt a spark of hope flare inside her, a fragile but vital thread in the suffocating tension that had consumed the morning. The manager, unaware of the man now at the diner's entrance, tightened his hold on Jasmine. "Do you think anyone out there cares about you?" he hissed, pressing her back against the wall. No one will notice if you mess up again. His words were venomous, meant to wound, meant to assert dominance. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly, but her eyes shifted toward the door just enough to catch Darius's stance. Calm, confident, unyielding, he was watching. Every muscle in her body seemed to exhale in relief, though fear and anger still coiled like snakes in her chest. From the main floor, the low murmur of customers grew tense. Some leaned forward, sensing that something had shifted, something beyond their understanding was unfolding. Darius began moving toward the corridor, slow and deliberate, commanding without a word. Patrons instinctively made way, a ripple of recognition passing through the room. Here was someone whose presence changed the dynamics instantly. The manager's grip faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough for Jasmine to feel a breath of hope. His smirk faltered as he finally noticed the man entering. The one whose eyes carried quiet authority, the one whose stance made it clear that he did not belong to the powerless. Recognition flickered across the manager's face, and suddenly, the power balance that had seemed absolute wavered. "Darius," Jasmine whispered, barely audible. Her voice carried a mixture of relief and lingering fear, the kind that comes from being cornered and humiliated, yet knowing that salvation is finally at hand. Darius stepped closer, eyes never leaving the manager. "Let her go," he said, calm but absolute. The weight of his tone, layered with authority and unspoken consequence, caused the manager to hesitate. For a moment, the arrogance that had fueled his actions faltered, replaced by calculation, realization, and fear. The narrow bathroom now felt even smaller, the walls closing in as Jasmine's pulse thundered in her ears. She took a deep, shaky breath, feeling the contrast of terror and hope collide. Every whisper from the diners, every glance from co-workers, every subtle movement became part of the electric tension in the room. The manager released her arms slightly, his smirk twisting into a sharp line of uncertainty. Who are you?" he asked, voice strained. "I'm the one who decides what happens in this diner from now," Darius replied evenly, stepping fully into the corridor. His presence was commanding, cinematic, almost impossible to ignore. The air seemed to thicken around him, the kind of authority that demanded respect without needing to raise a hand. Jasmine straightened slightly, her shoulders stiffening with a mixture of pride and lingering fear. She had been powerless moments ago, but now the tide had turned. The manager shifted, sensing the unspoken threat, the potential consequences. His smirk faded entirely, replaced by a flash of panic that Jasmine savored silently. Outside the bathroom, the murmurs had grown into a buzz. Customers whispered to each other, some shocked, some horrified. A few young staff members exchanged wide-eyed looks, realizing that what had been a routine display of humiliation had escalated into something much bigger. The atmosphere was electric, the tension almost tangible, as the power dynamics shifted before their eyes. Darius placed a firm hand on Jasmine's shoulder, grounding her. His eyes met hers, conveying a quiet, resolute message. "You are safe now." Not entirely free, not without consequence, but the scales had begun to tip. Jasmine drew in a long, shuddering breath, feeling the knots of fear in her chest loosen fractionally. The manager's voice rose again, but now it carried a tremor, a lilt of uncertainty. I was just," he stammered, his words failing to land. The control he had wielded so effortlessly moments before was slipping like sand through his fingers. Every patron's eyes in the diner were now on him, waiting for his next move, sensing that this was no longer just a simple workplace dispute. It was a reckoning in motion. Jasmine took a tentative step back, feeling the cool tile underfoot, the small but critical distance between her and the man who had humiliated her. Her mind raced, not with fear this time, but with strategy, clarity. She realized that the eyes watching, the whispers floating across the room, were witnesses. Public observation had shifted the weight of power. She could reclaim her dignity now. Not fully, but enough to remind the manager that control is never absolute. Darius's gaze never left the manager. "You will apologize. Right here, right now," he said, his voice low, firm, and cinematic in its authority. The manager's eyes darted, realizing the potential consequences. He looked at Jasmine, and for the first time, perhaps, saw her not as a subordinate to be humiliated, but as a person with allies, with connections, with the ability to change the outcome of this confrontation. The corridor seemed to shrink around them, tension crackling in the air, each second stretching into an eternity. Jasmine's pulse slowed slightly, her fear tempered now by the rising surge of courage. The presence of her husband, his unwavering calm and authority, had altered the narrative entirely. She could feel the momentum shift, the potential for justice within reach. The customers leaned in, some whispering encouragement, some nodding in realization. The diner had become a stage, yes, but now Jasmine was no longer alone in the spotlight. Darius's presence ensured that the manager's arrogance would face accountability. The atmosphere was taut with suspense, every participant holding their breath as the story reached a critical turning point. And in that moment, Jasmine understood something essential. Humiliation could be endured, fear could be faced, but dignity, once supported by allies and moral courage, could rise like a phoenix from the ashes. She straightened fully, squared her shoulders, and met the manager's gaze, not with fear, but with quiet defiance, ready for the moment that would tip the scales entirely. The corridor seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Jasmine stood beside Darius, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the manager who had caused her humiliation for hours. His smirk was gone, replaced by a thin line of fear and uncertainty. The presence of the diners, the staff, and her husband had shifted the power entirely. Now, for the first time that day, Jasmine could feel the scales of justice beginning to tilt. "Apologize," Darius commanded, voice low, resonant, carrying authority that filled the small space. The manager's lips twitched as if forming words, but hesitation froze them. Around them, whispers rose from the main floor, customers leaning forward, staff peeking around corners, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity of the manager's earlier cruelty. He stammered, eyes darting nervously between Jasmine and Darius. The weight of public scrutiny bore down on him. Each second that passed without action only magnified his failure, his cruelty laid bare for everyone to witness. Jasmine's chest rose and fell, steadying herself, feeling the power of being seen, the catharsis of no longer being invisible. "You humiliated her in front of everyone," Darius continued, calm but unrelenting. "You used fear, shame, and intimidation to assert power that wasn't yours to take. Apologize. Now." The manager swallowed hard. Sweat glistened at his temple. Jasmine could see the panic creeping in, the realization that his actions had consequences far beyond his control. He looked to the diners, then to his employees, who now stared at him with quiet judgment. His facade of authority crumbled under the weight of accountability. Finally, his voice broke through the tension, timid, shaky. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough, not fully, but it was a start." The words hung in the air, awkward and forced, but they carried the first genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing that Jasmine had heard all day. Jasmine's heart raced, the adrenaline ebbing into relief. She stood taller, the fire that had simmered inside her since the morning now burning brighter. "Not just words," she said, voice steady but firm. "You will take responsibility for your actions. For everyone in this diner to see. You humiliated me publicly. You will correct that publicly." A hush fell over the diner as the manager's eyes widened. He glanced around at the patrons who had witnessed his cruelty, the co-workers who had held their breath in fear, and finally at Jasmine, whose calm defiance now carried authority of its own. The room seemed to contract and expand with the weight of the moment. Jasmine stepped toward the counter, every movement deliberate, measured. She addressed the customers and staff, her voice carrying, clear and unwavering. "Today, I was humiliated by someone who believed power could be taken through fear and prejudice. But thanks to witnesses here, thanks to my husband's support, this behavior will no longer go unchallenged. Let this be a lesson. No one has the right to demean another based on race, fear, or status. A murmur of agreement rose from the diners. Some clapped softly, others nodded, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. The power that had been wielded against her had now shifted to her hands. She was no longer a passive participant in her own humiliation. She was a force, commanding acknowledgement and respect. The manager, now visibly shaken, nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted, voice low and shaky. I was wrong. I apologize to you, Jasmine, and to everyone here who witnessed my behavior." Jasmine allowed herself a brief, satisfied exhale. The apology, forced though it was, marked a turning point. The public humiliation that had seemed endless now had closure. Her body relaxed slightly, shoulders easing, and the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. She had endured, she had survived, and she had reclaimed her dignity. Darius stepped closer, his hand brushing hers lightly. His presence had been the anchor, the calm force that had shifted the dynamics, and Jasmine felt a deep surge of gratitude. But more than that, she felt pride in herself, for standing firm, for refusing to be silenced, for turning fear into a public reckoning. The diner staff began moving again, clearing plates and exchanging glances, the tension dissolving into a quiet energy of relief. Customers resumed their meals, some approaching Jasmine to offer words of support, small gestures of solidarity and recognition. She smiled faintly, nodding, feeling the weight of isolation lift as community and witness replaced fear. The manager, meanwhile, lingered near the counter, subdued, no longer carrying the air of dominance that had defined him all morning. Jasmine realized that the confrontation had changed him, perhaps not entirely, but enough to make him reconsider the abuse of power in front of witnesses. Accountability, she understood, was a force more potent than fear. A young server, who had watched anxiously from the back, approached Jasmine cautiously. I'm sorry that happened," he said quietly. "I didn't know what to do." Jasmine smiled gently. "You did what you could. Standing by silently is different from standing against injustice. Just remember what you learned today." Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, absorbing the scene. Coworkers returning to work with renewed respect, customers observing with quiet empathy, the manager humbled, and herself standing upright, no longer the victim of their judgment, but an agent of her own dignity. The diner felt familiar again, yet changed, infused with a new energy, a recognition that oppression could be challenged, humiliation could be reclaimed, and justice, even small and personal, was possible. She exhaled slowly, letting the adrenaline fade and the relief settle in. The morning had been a gauntlet of fear, shame, and racialized scrutiny, but she had emerged intact, stronger, more resolute. The humiliation that had weighed on her shoulders all morning had been met, confronted, and now faced public acknowledgement. She had turned the tide. Darius's hand remained lightly on hers, a quiet reassurance, a reminder that she was not alone. Jasmine felt a warmth in her chest, not only from survival, but from the justice she had reclaimed. The story would not end in silence or invisibility. It would be remembered, retold, and serve as a quiet but powerful example. Dignity cannot be stolen without consequence, and courage can turn fear into triumph. As she moved to the front of the diner, returning to her role with poise and grace, Jasmine felt the eyes of the customers and staff upon her, not with judgment, but with respect, recognition, and quiet admiration. The manager lingered near the counter, subdued, a shadow of his former arrogance. Jasmine's gaze met his once more, calm, unwavering, as if to say, "The power is no longer yours." The sun outside had shifted slightly, casting long streaks of light across the diner floor. The day had begun with humiliation and fear, but it would end with visibility, justice, and reclamation of dignity. Jasmine had endured the storm, survived the cruelty, and emerged with the recognition she deserved. He thought she had no one watching. He was wrong. Subscribe, because the next story might just hit closer to home than you think.